Hey internets! Looking back at things, I realized that I've made a lot of videos making fun of midwittery, and there's actually a very big reason why I do this. Because the thing is, when the plebs believe something that isn't true, well, that kinda happens all the time. Those people are a dime a dozen. Because of course, a random crack addict on the street who believes that he's under attack by space lasers in some kind of intergalactic gang stalking conspiracy against him, well, I mean, those guys don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. They do have a negative impact on society, but the difference is they don't have the power to shape society, a power that, unfortunately, midwits actually do possess. And now, I should clarify here that a midwit isn't necessarily the same thing as an average Joe. Rather, midwits are people who have an IQ roughly the same as an average Joe. The difference is that midwits tend to be well educated, and so they convince themselves that they are much smarter than they actually are. And so most of them actually are what you would consider above average in terms of intellect, just not necessarily in reasoning ability. And because of this, and because of often the credentials that they have, midwits tend to be the ones who are actually in charge of society, in places like the government, or our education system, so academia, and of course the media. And that's the basic reason why midwittery is actually more dangerous than dimwittery in many cases. And so this video is going to kind of shine some more light on that in a somewhat humorous fashion by shaping it into a tier list. I'm going to go over and rank a lot of the dumb things that midwits tend to believe in. And now this tier list is going to work a little bit differently than normal tier lists. I am not going to be ranking these beliefs and concepts based on how true or false they are, because they're all flawed. Rather, I'm going to be ranking them based on how smart the people are that they manage to fool. So in A tier, we're going to have concepts that even some people who aren't midwits believe in. So in other words, things that even people at Mensa level IQ might believe despite it being completely false. And then that just kind of goes from B, C, and D, from high functioning to low functioning midwit. And then finally in F tier are things that really only dimwits believe, but midwits will occasionally pretend to believe in them for reasons like virtue signaling or whatever. Or they may just be using the typical tactic of being disingenuous and trying to hide the truth from you. Also, this video is sponsored by Ground News. Ground News is not just another corpo-statist mainstream media source. Rather, Ground News is a service that lets you see through the bias and dishonesty of said mainstream news. They do this by compiling thousands of articles from various sources, both on the left and the right and the center, and then organizing them and summarizing them into an easy-to-read, easy-to-understand format, with tons of features that are designed to quickly show you what those articles are saying and where their bias lies. It's why I use Ground News for the research in a lot of my videos, and to show just how useful this is for seeing through nonsense, let's look at this article. Appeals Court throws out right-wing influencers conviction for 2016 election interference. First off, Ground News shows you a simple bias distribution chart that allows you to quickly see which news outlets are reporting on the story, which also lets you click on the sources to be taken directly to their article. And so Ground News serves as a fantastic general hub for whenever you want to just navigate the news. Secondly, Ground News generates multiple summaries of the story from the left, the center, and the right, allowing you to quickly notice the main differences in their general narratives. In this case, you may notice that the left-wing sources put emphasis on the claim that he was spreading falsehoods, while the right-wing sources put more emphasis on how overturning his conviction is a victory for free speech. In my opinion, nearly all the news sources on this particular story actually kinda got it wrong, and I'll be going into that a bit more later into this video. But for quickly seeing how the general media is reporting on a subject at a glance, this is a fantastic feature. It's what I like about Ground News. Normally figuring this out would require to actually read through all those articles, and let's be honest, ain't nobody got the time for that. There's also the blind spot feature, which is an excellent way to find stories that are being disproportionately covered from different sides of the political spectrum. Coverage bias and lying by omission is the most common form of media dishonesty, and so this is a good way to see those stories that certain journos don't want you to see. And also, Ground News continues to remain independent and subscriber funded, so to get access to these features, go to ground.news/Mentiswave or scan my QR code to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which will grant you unlimited access. Anyways, now let's actually get into the tier list. And first we have the classic, correlation does not imply causation. This one is a solid B tier. It's kind of one of those instant midwit indicators. Because of course the thing about most midwit beliefs and most midwit fallacies and most of the ways that midwits argue, it's all coming from a place of some level of pedantic correctness. Yes, correlation does not imply causation. However, with some solid reasoning and repeat of the data, combined with some good rationalism, you can usually figure out whether or not there is an actual causal link. And midwits will say correlation does not imply causation without giving any kind of further argument against those rational reasons for why a causal link exists. They think that it's some kind of magic phrase that they can say that instantly defeats any argument, which it absolutely is not. Again, solid B tier, midwit basics. Next up is educationism. So this is something some people might not know of, some of you may be aware of it. It's kind of a weird form of credentialist bigotry that midwits tend to partake in, where they view people who have less education than them them or less education below a certain threshold as being subhuman or less than human or whatever. You'll see this in, oh, you have a bachelor's degree? Well, I have a master's degree, so I'm more intelligent than you, I'm better than you, blah, 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 blah. So they have these kind of negative attitudes and stereotypes of people they perceive as less educated. And of course, it's wrong because there's a lot more to what makes someone intelligent than just education. That's why it's another solid B tier. Because the thing is, people who actually are abnormally intelligent, they tend to almost always be autodidacts. Especially now in the days of the internet. I've kind of pointed this out before. These days, it's getting more and more and more that a person's actual level of education doesn't exactly tell you what they know, and certainly doesn't tell you how smart they are. Again, solid B tier. Next up, we have appeal to authority. So this is an interesting one, which is that some midwits will try to argue that appeal to authority is a valid argument so long as the authority is valid. So for instance, say a doctor gives a diagnosis, and it's a real doctor and all of his credentials line up, etc., etc. And what will happen here is that a midwit will look at that diagnosis and argue that, okay, this is a valid diagnosis because it comes from a valid doctor. And of course, there's some pedantic correctness in this. A good doctor will most likely give a correct diagnosis if he's done all the work. But the problem is, it's not always the case. And so the real reason that makes a diagnosis valid or not coming from a doctor in this particular scenario is the reasoning and facts that the doctor used. So there's no such thing as a valid appeal to authority. There's just such thing as, if you're a gambling man, you're more likely to be correct if you side with a credentialed doctor. And anyway, this one goes into D tier. It's usually only low functioning midwits that have this problem. Standard midwits and higher functioning midwits will occasionally try and make this argument, but they're being disingenuous. They're smart enough to know that that's not a really good argument. Most people can figure out why this kind of appeal to authority thinking isn't really valid. It's really only the people in the double digit club that actually have problems comprehending this one. So D tier. Next is expertism worship, and yep, that is the Wikipedia logo right there. Because Wikipedia's rules are a fantastic example of what expertism worship is. It's this very cancerous belief that we can't treat facts as true unless they're interpreted by an expert first. And again, similar to appeal to authority previously, there's some pedantic correctness in here. People who aren't knowledgeable in a certain subject and don't know how to read academic papers and don't know how to go through primary sources, they'll often get a lot of things wrong. The problem is, it really isn't that difficult to learn how to read primary source data. It really isn't hard to learn how to read on an academic level. I'd say most people can learn it if they put the time into it. And the irony of expertism worship is that it actually ends up tricking people into believing a lot of stupid propaganda, because a lot of times the expertism worship also goes towards journos, and as we all know, journos are rarely honest. And that's actually the main problem with Wikipedia these days. All the facts have to be interpreted by reputable journalists. So when a journo makes an obviously fallacious argument, Wikipedia has to treat it as true because it's coming from a reputable, reliable source trademark. Very dumb, but it goes into C tier because it's a little bit more complicated than the appeal to authority issue. Next up is tabula rasa. So the belief in the blank slate, that we're all equal at birth, that there's no such thing as someone who's more intelligent than another for genetic innate reasons, and all of our behaviors are purely learned from the environment. There's no innate at birth differences. Now, of course, tabula rasa has been severely roundly debunked. No honest person who works in genetic research still believes it. The reason it's kind of believed by midwits is because tabula rasa is very favorable to the current neoliberal establishment belief system. And so this is just kind of another basic trait of midwits. Midwits tend to go with whatever the dominant thought of the status quo is. And so thus, a lot of times midwits will still believe in tabula rasa even though it's been debunked, and they'll use arguments that presuppose tabula rasa even though, again, it's not true. And they go with it simply because it goes with the current global establishment. And it is a solid C tier. Of course, higher functioning midwits will occasionally pretend to believe in tabula rasa, but they're smart enough to know by now that it's not true. Which then kind of brings us into the next one, the equity fallacy. The belief that unequal outcomes are always the result of unfair treatment or discrimination between groups or people or individuals or whatever. And it is solid C tier, for pretty much the same reason that tabula rasa is C tier, because one of the things the equity fallacy relies on is tabula rasa. If you understand why tabula rasa is bunk, you understand why the equity fallacy is bunk. Pretty self-explanatory there. Although it is slightly worse than tabula rasa because there are actually some reasons where even if tabula rasa was true, the equity fallacy still wouldn't be true, simply because of things like regional demographics. Like, for example, people who live in the mountains will not have the same outcome as people who live near the sea. So there's still other simple reasons for why it's not true, which almost drops it down to D tier, but it's close enough, and most standard midwits Midwits still make this argument all the time, so it stays in C tier right next to tabula rasa. Next up is democracy goggles. This is the unfortunate tendency to just never really see flaws in democracy as flaws in democracy, because people have decided that in the neoliberal world order, democracy is kind of a nice thing to believe in. And so when the flaws present themselves, people just kind of turn a blind eye to it. So they have rose-tinted goggles when looking at democracy. And a good example of this actually comes from the ground news insert that I did. So those of you who didn't just simply skip through the ad, well, you might know where I'm going with this already. The whole thing that Douglas Mackey did is really just a showcase of one of the flaws of democracy. He spread a meme that provided a falsehood on how to vote. And yeah, that's a little bit nefarious, but the problem is that's actually just a flaw with democracy. Democracy gets heavily screwed over by false information. And the thing is, because of how severely biased the media is, and because of how much critical information the government keeps from the public by just an ever-increasing stack of classified files that really have no business being classified, take all that into consideration and you realize that what Mackey did really isn't any worse than what the establishment already does in terms of spreading misinformation in order to stay in power. By, keeping the voter base nice and clueless about what's actually going on. And so the only thing Mackey was really guilty of is not having the establishment statist media on his side. And so that's just a very simple, straightforward example of how people have these democracy goggles. They'll see an event that showcases an obvious flaw with democracy, but nobody wants to recognize it as such, because again, people have these rose-tinted goggles of democracy always good. And unfortunately, it is A tier. I have seen highly intelligent people fall for this one too. If we were to be honest and go all the way up to something like S tier and +3 standard deviations, then no, that's kind of when it falls off. Most people at that level start to know that no, this whole majority rules democracy is entirely a grift, but we're not going that far. And thus, unfortunately, it is A tier. Next up is anti-theism. This is kind of the flawed thinking that everything will be all hunky-dory if everybody just dropped religion. That everyone would become a highly intelligent, rational human being if we just got rid of religion. And the problem is, it's not really true. Because the masses, the average Joe, kind of needs something to believe in. And so when you take away one belief, a lot of times it just gets replaced with another dogma. For example, look at wokeness, which is pretty much just, a secular religion. A lot of people in the cult of woke are ex-religious people. So a lot of apostates who, rather than becoming magically intelligent somehow, they just found a different idol to worship. This time, though, the idol isn't obviously an idol, so the only real difference is they don't understand what it is they're worshiping, which in many ways actually is worse. For example, here in the United States, I would honestly argue that Christianity provides a much more stable and sane meta-ethical moral epistemology than the absurd subjective morality that wokeness provides. But as for the ranking of it, this is going to surprise some people, but it actually goes into A tier. And the reason for this is that there's a lot of very highly intelligent, gifted individuals who kind of go through this as a phase. It's very common for an unusually intelligent person to kind of go through this in their teenage years, but then they get over it. Which means in some ways you could also rank this one by age. The older an anti-theist is, and you could probably make an argument that someone who still thinks this way past the age of 30 has been B tier, and past the age of 40 you could even put it in C tier. But because this misconception often does present itself in gifted individuals, it starts in A tier. So next up is healthy at every size. This is kind of one of those pushing the neoliberal desire for equality to its logical, clowny conclusion, where we just kind of pretend that all the evidence that shows that being morbidly obese is very, very bad for you, we just kind of pretend that that evidence doesn't exist for the sake of believing in equality. And it goes into pure brain rot. Nobody who isn't severely mentally impaired actually believes this. It is a thing that other midwits from other areas will occasionally pretend to believe in purely for the sake of virtue signaling, but reality is no sane functioning person actually believes this. And so it earns our first F tier. So next up is Source, another quintessential midwit mating cry. So midwits, being educated but often lacking in actual rational reasoning ability, they often have this tendency to make a mistake of, in an argument, demanding a source. They think that saying source, demand source, give me a source. They think that saying that debunks the argument. Or in other words, midwits will often ask for sources for rational arguments that can be understood and proven purely by just reasoning alone. And it is an essential midwit mating cry because sometimes asking for a source is a valid argument. When someone makes an empirical claim about something that happened and you don't believe them, like for instance a golfer claiming that they got a hole-in-one on every single hole in the course, thus beating out every single professional golfer, well, in something like that, it makes sense to say, oh, a picture, it didn't happen. But if it's something like a praxeological argument and a midwit pipes up and says, source, I need a source for this, well then of course, yeah, that's obviously not a valid refutation. The very midwit starter pack goes into C tier. Next is credentialism. And this is kind of tied to educationism and expertism worship, but it has enough properties to be unique from them. And this is just the tendency of midwits midwits to put too much weight on a person's credentials. And there again is, some pedantic correctness to it. An expert in a field is more likely to know something about their field than just a random average Joe. The problem again just comes down to the fact that autodidacts, especially the ones that like to go into autistic detail, as it's sometimes memed, they're often just as likely to know something as someone with the credentials. In fact, in some cases, they might even be more right, because the process of being an autodidact, when done properly, often allows someone to notice things that experts in the field don't always notice. There's a lot of information in a lot of fields out there that aren't necessarily taught in school. And a lot of times, a highly dedicated autodidact for a certain field of study will notice those things and understand them more than a credentialed individual. And that's just kind of one of the basic reasons why credential worship isn't always the best way to go. It makes sense if you're a betting man, because if you bet that the person with the credential is right over an average Joe, you'll usually be right, but it's not necessarily the end-all be-all, and it's certainly not a good argument. And it goes to B tier. It's another one of those weird ones that even the high-functioning midwits tend to have problems wrapping their head around it. But anyways, next up, this is a fun one, failing the BQ, or the breakfast question. This is where people are unable to understand conditional hypotheticals. For instance, you ask somebody, how would you have felt yesterday if you didn't have breakfast last morning? And they'll say, but I had breakfast last morning. And then you say, okay, well, right, imagine if you didn't have breakfast. And then the response is, but I had breakfast. I don't understand the question. And it's something where a bit of an internet meme, and people kind of noticing that people with extremely low reasoning skills have trouble understanding conditional hypotheticals. And the thing is, occasionally people will do this in arguments. When someone provides a hypothetical, they'll try to avoid the hypothetical by arguing against it by saying, well, but that would never happen. Okay, but what if it did happen? Oh, well, that would never happen. And it's nearly always a disingenuous tactic. Very few people actually have trouble with the BQ. It's one of those -1 standard deviation things. It's just people not wanting to actually deal with a hypothetical. So it goes into brain rot, another F tier. Next up is IQ cope. Or in other words, a lot of times midwits will often try to argue that IQ doesn't matter. Every single month or so, there seems to be a new midwit academic who thinks that they're the smartest person on the planet for looking at IQ data and screaming correlation does not imply causation. Or they'll argue that general intelligence is just a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's kind of funny, really. I keep seeing new variants of this argument against IQ pop up, and the person who comes up with it always thinks they're a genius for doing so. It's been refuted 1,000 times, of course. IQ is probably one of the best predictors we have. And plus, if you're just a rational person and you look at the tests that are used to measure IQ, they're all tests that just measure reasoning ability. And so, of course, questions that are based on reasoning, that require reasoning to figure out, are, probably going to be at least somewhat accurate in determining a person's basic reasoning ability. But, in some ways it kind of goes back to the whole neoliberal wanting to believe in equality being a real thing when it's not. And that's kind of why I call it an IQ cope. The reality is that IQ is one of the best predictor even when looking at socioeconomic status. In fact, it's a repeatable shown phenomenon where if you have a choice between having an IQ of 140 and being born to a poor family, or having an IQ of 90 and being born to a rich family, you are massively better off choosing to have a high IQ and being born to a poor family. And that, that shows a lot. And this is something that's very highly repeatable. People with higher G just consistently make better choices, and it's associated with nearly all positive traits. Pure cope, B tier. Next is radical postmodernism, another subject that I kinda need to make a full video on. The TLDR of it is that it's a philosophy that is very popular among midwits, because it allows them to kind of ignore contradictions by saying, oh, well, there is no objective truth, yada yada yada. Truth is just created by institutions, da 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 da. And the funny thing about it is it gets them into presupposing their own truth. And so if you're familiar with the problems of presuppositional apologetics and theology, then in a funny way, you actually already know what the problem is with radical postmodernism. That is a big TLDR of the problem with it, and it goes into C tier. Occasionally, people in B tier will also be radical postmodernists, but they usually use it to be disingenuous. The thing is, being above 1 standard deviation in G actually does give you pretty good reasoning ability. That's something I, again, have to stress. Midwits aren't necessarily stupid. In fact, a lot of them are quite intelligent, often above average. And so people in B tier are definitely capable of seeing through this. And so if you see one of them spewing radical postmodernist theory, then you know you're not dealing with a serious person. C tier. Next up is that's a conspiracy theory. And this is really pretty straightforward. It's just the midwit tendency to call anything that goes against the mainstream corporate status news cycle propaganda narrative that if you disagree with it, you're a conspiracy theorist. And of course, it's very stupid, because the thing is, if you are a person with relatively decent reasoning ability and you just read the news, and even if you don't really know what's actually going on, even if you have no knowledge of what most journos are talking about, the thing is, the average journo these days is so dishonest and deceptive that they use constant just a massive barrage of logical fallacies and dishonest arguments. And so any rational person is gonna know that the news is biased. It's really not hard to notice that the news is biased when, the average journal hit piece contains several circular arguments, several self-contradictions, and multiple guilt by association attacks. So a person with just any reasoning ability at all is gonna know that our mainstream media isn't exactly honest. So that goes into D tier. Only double-digiters actually have this problem. Again, people who are higher, so C tier and B tier, of course, will make this argument as well, but they're also being disingenuous when they do that. They don't actually believe it. So yeah, D tier. Next up is trust in mainstream media, which you might think is pretty much the same problem as calling everything that goes against MSN as conspiracy theory, but this one is just a little bit higher up there, so it goes into C tier because it's a little bit pedantically correct. The news doesn't necessarily outright lie, and so you're better off assuming that there's at least some truth in what they're saying. The problem is, again, just the knowledge that media isn't exactly honest, and as you get higher and higher up in reasoning ability, you notice more and more just how dishonest the media is. So this one goes into C tier instead. Then next up is the HBD question. Oh boy. Yeah, that one's definitely controversial, but for the sake of honesty, I have to include it in this video, because it is a big one. For those of you who don't know, the HBD question is the question of whether or not different population groups have different general intelligence, and whether or not this has a genetic cause. And what's interesting about it is that there is a media consensus about it. So what journalists will talk about and say is the consensus, and then there's the actual consensus from actually reading academic papers and actually seeing what people who do genetic research say about the subject. And it's interesting because it's completely different. If you listen to the media or go on Wikipedia or whatever, because expertism worship, you're going to see the claim that intelligence is entirely the result of environmental effects, or the 0% hypothesis. But then if you actually seriously start looking into it, especially as an autodidact, you'll start to notice a lot of weird stuff. For example, a lot of times the journal claims in regards to the HBD questions rely on surveys of social scientists who don't actually study genetics and hereditability at all, which that's pretty stupid. And then actual surveys of the people who really do study it, well, interestingly enough, there's actually no real consensus. But most of them agree it's somewhere between 10% and 90%, which is why it goes into A tier. It's entirely possible for a relatively intelligent person to not be informed on this, because you do have to kind of do a lot of digging to find the truth on it. Now, of course, when you do that research, it does actually go down. Someone who's looked into it and still believes the 0% hypothesis, then it goes down to B tier or even C tier, because when you actually research it, you start to realize that the chances of it being zero are very, very, very low. It's not necessarily impossible, it's just very unlikely. So again, A tier, moving on. Yes, next up is the bureaucracy question. This is just thinking that enough bureaucracy prevents abuse. And again, like many midwit beliefs, there is some pedantic truth to it. Bureaucracy definitely makes abuse of certain systems to be a lot harder. But the problem is that when someone starts to understand the bureaucracy and how it functions, they're still able to abuse it. And what actually happens is that bureaucracy, what it really does is it just makes the abuse harder to track, because then you need another insider who understands the bureaucracy in order to notice things like embezzlement and such. And so the midwits' love of bureaucracy is ill-placed, to say the least. And sadly, it goes into B tier. Lots and lots of educated people still don't quite understand why this one is wrong. And it's a particularly damaging belief, because it's one of the reasons why a lot of educated people don't like libertarianism, because they think that they can solve the contradictions of statism by simply making it bureaucratic, which of course just actually increases costs and does not actually prevent abuse. And in fact, it just provides a cloak for the abusers. So unfortunately, B tier, moving on. Yes, next is racism. I figured it wouldn't be fair unless I at least went into a little bit of some right-wing midwittery, which honestly, in the way I define left and right, isn't really right-wing, but people who self-identify as right-wing are more likely to kind of get into this negative mindset of thinking, oh, actually, we should just be saying that racism is good. No. You should not be saying racism is good. Racism is quite bad. And here's why. Now, yes, there is some pedantic correctness in this one, because if you go by the far left attempt to redefine racism as prejudice plus power and redefine racism as unequal outcomes, then yes, you could make the argument that in the way they define racism, racism actually is a good thing. But that's only because the far left's attempt to redefine racism is completely ridiculous. Really, we should be sticking to the old definition of racism, the one that actually makes logical sense and doesn't contradict itself, because the problem is collective guilt is just always bad. It's bad from both a consequentialist and from a natural rights perspective. Even if we were to assume that the HBD question is the other way around, that it's 100%, racism still wouldn't be justified, because if you look at differences between population groups and differences between ethnicities, it is not that wildly different. For example, something like 1 in 5 African Americans have an above average IQ. So even if you're just completely blackpilled on the HBD question and you think it's 100%, which by the way, we have pretty good evidence to suggest it's not 100%, it's probably closer to 50%, it's still not reasonable to be a racist. There's plenty of intelligence and just all around decent people from every ethnicity on the planet. So while we may have some differences and equality is a false god, the differences aren't that big enough that we can't get along. And also, there's a lot more to human beings than just IQ. There are a lot of other good qualities about people around the world. And so I kind of view the Wignot mindset as an example of right-wing midwittery. Because the differences aren't that huge, it is still always going to be more accurate to just judge people on individual traits. And so being a racist really isn't something good, and it's not something the right should associate it with, because if we're being honest, the far left is a lot more racist these days. They just hide it because they use a different definition of racism. Woke ideology is entirely ethno-collectivist. That's why they feel the need to redefine racism as prejudice plus power. It's not because it's a sensible definition, but because they need to define it that way in order to avoid an obvious contradiction with everything else they're saying. And I think the correct position is for the right to fight this by being individualist as opposed to being collectivist. And so that way you can point out why the socialists are wrong on principle, rather than inconsistent collectivist arguments which always eventually lead you down to the path of, well, it's good when I do it and bad when you do it. Which, you know, sounds a bit insane. Anyways, solid B tier. Ooh, next up is rights come from the state. This is a very common false belief among very educated people, mainly because you have to be really knee-deep in both philosophy and history to really understand why it's wrong. And also because, again, on a certain superficial level, it does make sense. You do need power in order for rights to actually manifest in reality. For example, if someone murders another guy in the forest and nobody ever finds out about it and he gets away with it, there's no magical angel of vengeance or angel of justice that's going to come out and punish the guy who did the murder. I mean, sure, there's people who believe in karma and whatnot, and people who believe that they'll be punished in the afterlife and whatnot, but we shouldn't rely on things that you don't really know for sure for the sake of philosophy. That's not really honest reasoning. When you do that, you're relying too much on something that is completely unfalsifiable in order to deal with a major ideological failing. And so thus, a lot of people look at that and assume that you need strength for rights to exist. Sort of. You need strength for rights to exist in the short run, but in the long run, the rights that actually make sense, the rights that actually work, are the rights that are actually good. Because when you have a society that bases itself on rights beyond property rights, or bogus rights, or inconsistent rights, where some people have property rights and some people don't, the issue is that that always creates an unstable society because it creates conflict. And so in the long run, rights actually come from what is stable. They come from looking at what makes sense and then figuring out, okay, what's going to actually work and maintain a stable society? What rights allow a society to grow and flourish, and what rights don't? What rights create conflict? What rights create logical contradictions, etc., etc.? And that's where you reach the conclusion of property rights. For example, if a society allowed murder, well, that's a society that very few people would actually want to be a part of. It wouldn't last very long if murder wasn't against the law. In fact, ironically, the people who would flourish the most in that society would be the people who would form protection groups, you know, against random murders anyways. And so yes, you do need strength to actually enforce the rights, or a cliche way of putting it is that one of the most important things for the hero is that the hero needs to be strong so that, you know, he can actually win. But in the long run, the hero also needs to be on the side of justice. I know that's a cliche, silly way of putting it, but that is where rights actually come from. And unfortunately, this goes to A tier. It is such a common misconception. Again, you really have to be knee-deep in the philosophy to understand this one. I sadly do see very intelligent people well above the midwit line who don't get this one. I don't like putting this in A tier. I hate that it is in A tier, but I have to be honest, it's in A tier. Next up is conventional morality. So this is people who think that morality comes from things like majority rules, or my feelings, care harm morality comes from this, or people who believe that the legal system is a good source for morality. This kind of subjective morality is whatever people say it is sort of morality. It is of course an extremely flawed and completely inconsistent moral system that is constantly proving itself wrong every single time a culture shift happens, and it is solidly in C tier. It's kind of the entry level to radical postmodernism. Occasionally people in B tier or even A tier will try and argue based on conventional morality, but I don't think they actually believe it when they say it. B tier should be smart enough to see through this one. Again, these are not being rated based on the validity of the argument. All of these are wrong. Rather, these beliefs are being rated based on the average that they're most likely to fool. So yeah, solid C tier. Next up, yes, the moralistic fallacy. This is believing that reality can be affected by what you believe to be good. It is a common fallacy you might see with neolibs coping about tabula rasa. Just because you believe equality to be the ultimate good does not magically change the fact that tabula rasa has been debunked over and over and over again. I am so sorry to all the boomer libs out there. Tabula rasa is not a thing. You're gonna have to get over it. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you'll just die before you get over it. Whatever. Anyways, I'm gonna put it in D tier. Because the thing is, you can easily understand why the moralistic fallacy, why this type of reasoning is invalid if you're at all average or above. It's really only the people in D tier, it's only the double digiters who genuinely have a problem understanding why this reasoning doesn't work. People in C and B tier will use this fallacy, but only when they have a very severe ideological need to do so. When they do it, they're really just engaging in a combination of being disingenuous and riding the hamsterization wheel. You have to be kind of genuinely pretty dumb, though, to not be able to understand why believing that something is good doesn't magically make it real. Like, for instance, thinking that it would be good if scarcity didn't exist. Well, I mean, yeah, that would be good if there was no such thing as scarcity, and we all lived in heaven, but we don't, and the believing it's good doesn't magically change that. So yeah, it's actually D tier. Next up is word cell maxing, and this is less of a belief and more of just a tactic that midwits tend to do. It's where they think that they can take a logically incoherent argument and salvage it with enough word celery, or thinking that they can take a bad argument with bad reasoning behind it and just give it enough of an academic spin, and that the argument becomes better somehow. You'll see this a lot if you go to Reddit. This is a Reddit midwit favorite. They'll put a large amount of effort into a post, even try to back it up with a few journo sources, and they seem to think that that can change the quality of the argument. It really doesn't. You can almost think of this as the intellectual version of the labor theory of value. They just don't understand that putting more labor into it doesn't actually give it value. It's kind of the same issue. Dumping a bunch of non-colloquial verbiage into a bad argument, well, unfortunately, it's still a bad argument. And it's also kind of another midwit mating cry, so C tier. Then next up is word soup. Kinda goes hand in hand with word celery, but it's a little bit more complicated. Word soup is kind of the same thing, dumping a bunch of non-colloquial verbiage into an argument, to give it this mirage of intellectualism. But this one doesn't necessarily have to be a bad argument. Word celery is when they actually are using a bad argument, whereas word soup is when they kind of utilize this linguistic thought to pad just about anything. The most common one is the fact that any respectable philosophy or concept that is worth studying generally has two versions. It has a simplified version that includes what you'd call lies for children, and then it has the actual version where those lies are taken away to no longer have to simplify it for an audience that doesn't really know anything. And so midwits will often deconstruct the simplified version using word soup, and then they'll pretend like they've proven the more advanced version to be faulty by doing so. Like a common one I see is in sort of anti-theism. A midwit will explain why a specific religious doctrine makes no sense, and then they think that they have disproven the existence of any kind of God or any kind of otherwise spiritual or higher dimensional being by, pointing out a specific inconsistency in a specific religion with their specific dogma. Or they'll just take a simple concept and overanalyze and overcomplicate it and think that doing so is the height of intellectualism. Or TLDR, a simple way to put word soup is that it's just the art of being pretentious. What they're saying may or may not be true, but there was no need to pad the argument with word soup regardless. And that's why it goes to B tier instead of C tier. Then next up is gender equality extremism. And this is the belief that there's effectively no real difference between men and women on a biological level besides our reproductive fetus. So things like, oh, well, if we just fed girls the same amount that we fed boys, then girls would be just as strong as men when they grow up. Crazy things like that. And that is why it is pure brain rot tier. No even semi-intelligent person, or even just a double digiter, actually believes this. This is another one of those sort of neo-lib want to believe in equality at all costs, and so we're gonna virtue signal at the top of our lungs sort of thing. And nobody really believes it. You have to dig really, really deep into some pretty crazy feminist theory to find people who actually believe this. And every single one of them is completely nutter butter. Now, of course, there is a light version of gender equality extremism, and that's believing that there's no mental differences between men and women, and that that's entirely environmental, and that just kind of goes into the same basket as tabula rasa. That would be a solid C tier. But for the people who argue it also for the physical differences, totally insane. Pure brain rot. Not even midwits believe this. When you see a midwit arguing for this, which is pretty rare these days, you normally would only see this way back in maybe the 1980s or something. If you see someone arguing this, they're not being serious. Anyways, next up is debate broism. And this is just people thinking that debates are the height of being able to figure out what is true and what is not. And the problem is it's not true. Yes, debates kind of force you to engage, but the problem is it's very easy to force people to engage on grounds that aren't exactly honest. For instance, here's a secret that a lot of debate bros don't really want you to know, which is that the biggest thing that will make you good at debates is not so much always knowing what you're talking about, and it's not so much even being logically consistent. What you really want to do is practice very specific arguments on a very specific talking point, and then learn how to bait your opponents into those talking points, so that way you can beat them with experience and show them how you have more sources on the topic than they do. And so, in other words, the most effective way to win debates is to drag people into practice ground and then beat them there. And the problem is that means there really isn't any way to be a good debater unless you are at least somewhat disingenuous to some degree. Because the simplest way to drag people into those talking points you practiced is to ask questions regarding the topic that you've researched. And so it's a lot more than just the problem of the Gish-Gallop and the problem of the on-the-spot fallacy. The problem is that these debates are really just one with rhetoric and finding ways to trick people into getting into debates with you over topics that you've already extensively prepared for. And if you know this and you pay attention to a lot of prominent debate bros, you'll notice that the most famous ones, the ones that people consider to be great at debates, well, they're actually pulling this disingenuous tactic all the freaking time. And so this idea that debates force you to engage, well, it's kind of a big misconception. What debates actually do is they force you to learn how to be good at rhetoric on the spot, which largely includes setting traps to drag people into topics that you've prepared for, and then pretending like because they don't have a source immediately readily available for you on the spot, then they must be wrong, which you know isn't true at all. A lot of times the things that debate bros claim can be easily disproven these days just by putting them into a Grok deep search or something, or not even using AI, just looking it through Google just to fact check any random debate. And you'll quickly discover that even the most popular debate bros that everyone considers to be great at debates are actually completely full of crap. Like, for instance, take Sam Cedar's arguments against libertarianism in his debates and then cross-reference them with what the Mises Institute has answers for, and you'll quickly realize that Sam Cedar has absolutely no idea whatsoever what he's talking about. But because debate bros are so good at asking disingenuous questions, until they, find something their opponent isn't exactly up to speed on, debate bros can easily fool the audience into believing things that aren't really true. And as for ranking, this one comes really close to B tier, but it's actually C tier. I think most reasonable people can figure out, just by doing some basic fact-checking, that the results of a lot of debates aren't really grounded in fact. A person winning a debate on subject A doesn't actually mean what they said about subject A is true. It usually just means they were better prepared than their opponent. That's all. Which is why I'm kind of annoyed when I see people at B tier being debate bros, because they know darn well what they're doing. They know darn well that it's a grift, and they do it anyway. Such is the world we live in. So yeah, moving on. Eternal neoliberalism. This is effectively the belief that the current neoliberal establishment can actually last for more than another 100 years. And oh, it is so sad that I have to put this in A tier, because you do have to actually do a pretty good amount of research to figure out why this one is wrong, mainly just due to the massive amount of propaganda out there. But it's kind of similar to the HBD question. Once you actually do start looking into it, it actually drops all the way down to C tier. In fact, you could almost argue that this could be B tier today, simply because it's getting more and more obvious that putting aside the debt and ignoring the issues of Social Security and ignoring the sort of light socialism that neoliberalism follows, those problems are kind of becoming, more and more obvious every year. We're kind of already seeing the negative effects of trying to ignore the debt, and so thus all the cope arguments for why we can ignore the debt are kind of being pretty quickly proven wrong, not just on rational grounds, but actually being proven wrong on empirical grounds as well. So it's getting increasingly more and more delusional to think that things can keep going the way they're going. I put it in A tier simply because you kind of have to remember this is based a little bit more on IQ, and IQ is reasoning ability. And so a highly gifted individual might believe in this one simply because they haven't looked at the facts yet. Maybe I'm being a little bit too generous here. Maybe it can go in B or even C tier already, but for now I'll put it in A tier. But next up, let us move on to rejection of praxeology. And rejections of praxeology, or attempts to debunk it, usually come from just not really quite understanding it. It's the study of human action and recognizing that you need rationalism in order to fully understand the reasoning and logic behind why people do what we do and choose to act in the ways that we do, etc., etc. It's just kind of the understanding that our behavior is purposeful based on thoughts inside our head and not just completely random. We have goals and such. Like, for example, a simple proof of praxeology is that you saw the thumbnail of this video and you clicked on it with the purposeful goal of wanting to watch this video. And this is just recognizing that, yes, the thoughts inside your head that led up to this purposeful behavior, it's true that those thoughts cannot be empirically measured, especially since since they happened in the past. But that doesn't mean that you can just ignore the study of human action. And what a lot of people will do is they'll try to reject praxeology based on this really weird circular argument where they don't recognize that praxeology is also to some degree a refutation of the empiricist epistemology. And so they'll try to use empiricism to disprove praxeology without realizing that what they're essentially doing is that they're presupposing empiricism to prove that a refutation of empiricism isn't correct. So they're actually committing a circular argument when they do that. And I'd say it goes into C tier. I don't really see very many high-functioning midwits trying to debunk praxeology. I see the high-functioning midwits, especially when you're dealing with like a communist or a socialist high-functioning midwit, they usually just try to completely ignore praxeology because they know that they can't really completely defeat it. They kind of know that the refutations of praxeology are inherently circular and don't really work. It's usually the standard midwits who don't really notice that and will unironically make the circular argument without realizing why what they did just didn't make any sense. And therefore, it is in C tier. And moving on to the next one. Oh yeah, speaking of socialists, this is a great one. Socialism can work if we just do it my way. Every freaking intellectual seems to think that if we just do socialism their way, then socialism can finally work. And this is kind of an issue with intellectuals in general sometimes. And that a lot of smart people will think that they can take a flawed system and make it work because they almost see it as a challenge. And so every Harvard postgrad will at some point try to sit down and think of how they can make socialism work. And this mainly just comes from people not really studying the reason why it doesn't work. It's kind of like people who think that they can violate the second law of thermodynamics if they just organize magnets in the right way. It comes from people not understanding that law and how it works. And this is kind of the same thing. This usually stems from people not understanding the knowledge problem and not understanding the inherent flaw of central economic planning. Because when you study those, you'll then have a rational understanding of why socialism can in fact never work and know your secret way that you just came up with of how you just move certain bureaucracies around here and there that you can make socialism work. No. You cannot make socialism work. It is impossible to make socialism work. And sadly, as much as I hate it, I have to put this in A tier because I see genuinely high intelligent people, very gifted individuals thinking that they can just make socialism work. Again, it's almost like a challenge trying to take this flawed system and thinking if they can find a way that they can think to make it work. So anybody who hasn't studied the reasons behind why it can't work, people who haven't really studied the knowledge problem at length and how it functions, you can in fact see an unusually gifted, unusually intelligent individual trying to think out a way to make socialism work. Now, on the flip side, if they have studied economics at length enough to understand the knowledge problem, then you can move this down to B tier. But getting autistically into economics and how it functions isn't for everybody, so unfortunately, A tier. Next up is, oh yes, the nootsie bar. This is an interesting belief with a lot of weird implications that a lot of midwits believe despite them not really being correct. And this is really just kind of a liberal fear-mongering where if a bar allows nootsies into the bar, then eventually the bar will be filled with nothing but nootsies. And this is just kind of not really understanding that exposing yourself to an idea or some intellectual work doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you're going to be a sponge for that idea. I see this a lot in people who think that certain books are dangerous. For instance, I have read Mein Kampf, but I'm very obviously not a Wignot. In fact, many of my libertarian beliefs go very much in the opposite direction of Mein Kampf. Reading it did not make me a nootsie. But sometimes if you tell certain midwits that, they'll just immediately assume, oh, you've read this book, therefore you must agree with everything in it. They'll see Mein Kampf on someone's shelves and go, that's a nootsie, blah, 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 blah. And it's not actually true. Most people who have a decent reasoning ability are able to criticize a work as they're going through the work. And same thing with a bar that allows nootsies into it. Plenty of people are going to be able to dissect what the nootsies are saying in real time. This mysterious force by which everybody in the bar will somehow be hypnotized into nootsie beliefs, it's just not a thing. And in many cases, it's really just a secret thing for censorship. Because I'm going to put this in C tier, but you will see B tier high-functioning midwits trying to make this argument as well, but they're actually being disingenuous. A very common commie tactic is to just call everyone a nootsie and then justify censoring nootsies in order to, what they're really wanting to do is censor anybody who isn't a communist. So the people who actually struggle with it, C tier, but you will see a disingenuous commie in B tier trying to use this to justify censorship. So it's also used as a grift. And that's what actually makes it really dangerous. Next up is per capita. And yes, that is a picture of a bear. I'm sure a lot of you will get the reference, but for those of you who don't, Google man versus bear and be prepared for a whole lot of brain rot. Now, this of course is one of those arguments that, again, like everything I'm throwing in here, various midwits will pretend like they don't understand per capita as kind of a disingenuous tactic, but usually, even in this case, you usually won't even see B tier making per capita mistakes. You usually only see this in D tier and C tier being disingenuous. People at B tier generally know, they have good enough reasoning skills to understand that, okay, yeah, I probably shouldn't be making an argument that ignores per capita, because they kind of know how stupid it makes them look when the fallacy is exposed. Then next up is semantics versus philosophy. This is kind of another weird one. It's a little bit tied to word soup and word cell maxing. And this is just more or less people who don't really understand a philosophy. They'll think that they can get around issues with that philosophy by arguing semantics. It's not understanding that semantics cannot circumvent philosophical contradictions. It's often used to justify being philosophically illiterate. So that's why I'm using kind of the meme. You might recognize this meme if you've seen some of my other content. This guy going, I do not understand the logical conclusions of my own beliefs, therefore I am exempt from the consequences. That's kind of what this argument is. It's that people who are philosophically illiterate will often try to think that they can change definitions to get around the logical conclusions of their philosophy when it really doesn't. Like, for example, the far left not understanding that the logical conclusions of the ethno-collective guilt that they believe in is basically the same thing as wig not racism. I see a lot of postmodernist woke-toids very often thinking that they can get around that by shifting some definitions around, and sorry, but no, it doesn't actually work. You can change definitions around all you want. If the philosophy behind it doesn't change, you haven't actually accomplished anything. And it goes to C tier. This is kind of on the line of C tier and B tier because it's a more complicated version of word cell maxing to some degree. But I've noticed that people in B tier, the higher functioning midwits, the above one standard deviation midwits, from what I've seen in them, the ones that use this argument, I can tell that they can kind of tell that what they're saying doesn't actually make sense. It's again another one of those things where someone who is one level above this will argue it, but argue it disingenuously. So C tier. Next up is presupposing materialism to, prove materialism. It's on the line of B tier and A tier. And I should stress also that this isn't about whether or not materialism is true. It's just about whether or not a midwit relies on this particular circular argument to prove it. Like saying, oh, we can't find any material evidence that materialism isn't true, therefore materialism is true. It's kind of unique in that it's one of the very few circular arguments that people above one standard deviation will still make. Next up is the empiricist epistemology. This is another one where you kind of have to be knee deep in the philosophy to fully understand why it doesn't really work. However, it goes to B tier because most genuinely highly intelligent people can kind of get a feel for why empiricism has some holes in it. And then lastly is dichotomy brain, saving a fun one for last. This is less of a belief and more of just a standard midwit practice. Now, technically, B tier and C tier do this too, this just kind of state of constantly leaning towards dichotomous thinking or always thinking in black and white. It's actually one of the biggest tells that someone you're dealing with isn't exactly very highly unusually intelligent. However, it goes to D tier because D tier, or the people who are in the double-digit club, that's when you can't really understand why it is wrong. D tier is where you run into people who genuinely cannot comprehend why their false dichotomy is a false dichotomy. Even when you point it out to them and explain to them, hey, there's a gray area here, they'll still fall back into their dichotomy brain thinking. A big one I often see is victim blaming. For instance, someone will say, oh, I went to the bad part of town while wearing all this diamond jewelry, and I didn't have any kind of self-defense on me whatsoever, and I got robbed and lost everything. And then someone might point out, well, hey, maybe you shouldn't go to that bad part of town. A lot of times people will then jump on that and go, oh, you're just blaming the victim. You should be able to do whatever you want. You should be able to leave your doors unlocked. We don't need security. That's blaming the victim. And people just not understanding that that doesn't necessarily mean you're blaming the victim. It's just the recognition that there are certain things you can do to reduce the chances that you might get robbed. It doesn't mean that you're at fault for your own robbery. It's recognizing that there is a gray area in a lot of bad things that can go wrong. Like having a home security system will decrease the chance that your home will get broken into, but doesn't mean you're blaming the victim when you point that out. It's just kind of recognizing that we live in a reality and that reality isn't perfect. But that's kind of a lot of how midwits tend to think. Even though I'm putting this one in D tier, that is really the general midwit mantra, is thinking that they can ignore reality with enough word soup and word celery and enough mental gymnastics, etc., in order to justify beliefs based on what makes them feel good rather than based on what is reality. And so here is the full and complete tier list, and that is all I have to say for now. A little bit longer video than usual, but hey, it was fun for me to make, and I hope it was also fun for you to watch. But again, for now, that is all. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, or again by checking out Ground News, this video's sponsor. That is all. Till next time.